The moment I stepped into courtroom 3B, a place I had presided over for 4 decades, my daughter, Abigail, let out a condescending giggle. It wasn't a nervous titter. No, it was that cruel, dismissive sound, the kind of laugh a child makes when they believe they've finally outsmarted the old man. She leaned over to her husband, Brandon, whispering loud enough for the bailiff to hear, clear across the aisle. "Look at him. He looks like a lost puppy. I bet he thinks we're taking him to a potluck at the community center." Brandon didn't even bother to glance my way. He just shook his head, that arrogant smirk playing on his lips, the same smirk I'd wanted to wipe off his face for 15 years. He stared intently at his phone, probably checking the Chicago Bears' latest injury report or some fantasy sports score, as if the fate of a man's entire life was less important than his digital distractions. They sat there, impeccably dressed in designer suits likely paid for with funds they'd already siphoned from my accounts. They were utterly confident. This was it, they thought, the final curtain call for Arthur Sterling. They believed they were looking at a senile, helpless 72-year-old man, a mere shell who needed a court-appointed guardian. But then, Judge Eleanor Vance, a woman I had personally mentored through her darkest career challenges, looked up from her docket. Judge Vance was known for her stern demeanor, her no-nonsense approach to the law. Yet, as her eyes met mine, the color visibly drained from her face. Her hand, which had been reaching for her gavel, began to tremble ever so slightly. She took off her glasses, rubbed her temples, and looked again, her gaze lingering as if she'd just seen a ghost walk into her courtroom. The silence in the room became heavy, thick, almost suffocating. Judge Vance leaned into her microphone, her voice barely a whisper, yet it echoed with an uncharacteristic awe through the suddenly still room. "My God," she murmured, "is that really him?" Everyone turned. The court reporter, a young man I remembered from his internship, stopped typing mid-sentence. The bailiff, a burly veteran named Officer Miller who had served under me for years, straightened his spine with a snap. Abigail's giggling stopped abruptly. Her triumphant smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of pure confusion. She looked at Judge Vance, then back at me, then at the judge again. She didn't understand. She couldn't possibly know that the man she now called a useless old fool was known in these very halls as the Gavel, a federal judge who had put away more organized crime bosses, corrupt city officials, and white-collar criminals than she had pairs of designer shoes in her overflowing closet. I didn't utter a single word. I simply adjusted the cuffs of my bespoke suit jacket, a quiet, almost imperceptible gesture, and met my daughter's terrified gaze dead on. Then, I offered her a cold, terrifying smile. That was the day I initiated the final lesson. The day they would learn, in the most painful way imaginable, that you never, ever declare war on a man who quite literally wrote the book on strategy. But before I tell you how I systematically dismantled their little scheme, let me take you back. The war didn't start in that hushed courtroom, surrounded by the echoes of justice. It started 3 months earlier, on a crisp autumn day, the day I buried my beloved wife, Eleanor. The grass at Willow Creek Cemetery was still wet, dewy from the morning rain, and the cloying scent of lilies, Eleanor's favorite, was making me profoundly nauseous. I stood alone by the freshly turned grave, a glass of single malt scotch clutched in my hand, its amber liquid tasting like ash in my mouth. 45 years. 45 beautiful, tumultuous, enriching years I had been married to Eleanor. She was my anchor, my conscience, the only person on this earth who could truly soften my notoriously sharp edges. Without her, I felt like a colossal ship, adrift and rudderless in a furious storm. The loss was a physical ache, a gaping wound in my soul. Yet, even as I was saying my final, silent goodbyes to the love of my life, my daughter Abigail and my son-in-law Brandon were already calculating, their minds cold and calculating, fixed firmly on the inheritance. I watched them from across the crowded living room at the wake, held in the very house Eleanor and I had built together. Abigail wasn't shedding a single tear. Instead, she was meticulously checking her makeup in a small, ornate, compact mirror, her expression one of vague impatience. Brandon wasn't comforting her. He was prowling my library, a room filled with legal tomes and first editions, running his hands over the antique mahogany furniture, assessing the value of my irreplaceable book collection with the detached, greedy eye of an auctioneer. I have always had excellent hearing, a trait I often kept hidden, much like I hid my razor-sharp mind behind a carefully constructed mask of profound grief. I walked quietly toward the hallway, a large, ornate space that connected the library to the kitchen, and positioned myself behind a thick marble pillar. "It's a big house," Brandon whispered, his voice low, almost guttural, brimming with insatiable greed. 4.5 million. Easy. The market in Willow Creek is absolutely booming right now. Abigail sighed, not with sadness, but with an almost palpable impatience. "We have to move fast, Brandon. Dad is already losing it. Did you see him staring at the coffin? He's checking out. We need to get power of attorney before he spends it all on some ridiculous charity or something equally stupid." Brandon nodded, his eyes gleaming. "We'll move in next week," he replied, already mapping out their strategy. "We'll tell him it's to take care of him. Once we're inside, we control the environment. We control the mail, the phone lines, the accounts. He won't even know what hit him." I gripped my scotch glass so hard I thought the crystal would shatter in my hand. My wife, the woman who had shared my bed and my life for nearly half a century, was not even cold in the ground. And they, my own flesh and blood, were already planning the hostile takeover of my life, my home, my very existence. They didn't see me as a father, a mentor, a man of consequence. They saw me as an obstacle, a frail, elderly barrier to a $4 million payday, a commodity, nothing more. I stepped out from behind the pillar, and they both jumped, startled like children caught with their hands in the cookie jar. "Dad!" Abigail exclaimed, her voice instantly changing to a sickly, sweet, cloying tone that made my skin crawl. "We were just saying how worried we are about you. You shouldn't be alone in this big house." I stared at her, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make them genuinely uncomfortable, allowing the tension to coil in the air. "I am not alone, Abigail," I said, my voice low, strained by grief, but with an underlying steel. "I have memories, and a house full of them." Brandon stepped forward, clapping a hand on my shoulder. It felt heavy, condescending, a paternalistic gesture from a man who had never earned the right to offer comfort. "That's the thing, Art," he said, using my nickname with a familiar ease that now felt utterly repellent. "Memories don't pay the bills or maintain a property like this grand estate. We want to help. We're going to stay for a while, just to get you settled." I didn't say yes. I didn't say no. I just turned and walked away, needing to escape their perfidious presence. I knew, with a certainty forged in countless courtrooms, that if I spoke another word, I would evict them right then and there. But the judge in me, the part of me that understood strategy and due process, knew you don't file charges until you've built an undeniable case. I needed to see how far their avarice would drive them. I needed evidence. And I didn't have to wait long. The first strike, a calculated blow against my independence, happened less than 48 hours later. I was in the garage, a sanctuary for me, meticulously polishing the chrome on my pride and joy. A 1967 Shelby Mustang GT, 500, midnight blue with those iconic white racing stripes. I had bought that car the year I passed the bar exam, a symbol of my hard-won independence, my history, my youthful defiance. It wasn't just a car. It was a tangible piece of my soul, valued at over $220,000. It was, to me, absolutely priceless. Brandon sauntered into the garage, eating a crisp Granny Smith apple, chewing loudly, the sound irritatingly amplified in the cavernous space. "Nice car, Harry," he said, using my old nickname again. "Shame it just sits here gathering dust." "I drive it every Sunday," I replied, not looking up from the fender I was buffing, my voice deliberately even. "Yeah, about that," Brandon said, leaning against the doorframe, his posture radiating casual arrogance. "Abigail and I were talking. We think it's unsafe for you to be driving a beast like this. You know, with your vision and your reflexes slowing down, you could hurt someone, or yourself." "My vision is 20/20 with my glasses, Brandon," I stated, straightening up, wiping the grease from my hands with a rag. "And my reflexes are just fine. I still beat half the neighborhood kids at online chess. He chuckled, a dismissive, patronizing sound. Come on, Harry. Be realistic. You're 72. You shouldn't be behind the wheel of a muscle car. Give me the keys. I'll take it to a specialist mechanic I know in the city. Get it winterized. Maybe put it in long-term storage for you. Save you the insurance money. I stood up fully, facing him. This wasn't a suggestion. It was a test. He was probing my boundaries, seeing how much I would yield. No, I said, my voice calm, unwavering. The car stays here. Nobody drives it but me. Brandon's smile didn't reach his eyes. He stared at me for a moment, his jaw tightening, a flicker of irritation in his gaze. Have it your way, old man. Just trying to help. He turned and walked away, but I felt a prickle of unease on the back of my neck, the kind of instinct that had saved my life more than once during my years on the bench. That night, I locked the garage with the heavy deadbolt. I put the keys in my bedside drawer, not just under, but times next to times my old service revolver, a Colt Python that still packed a punch. I went to sleep feeling profoundly uneasy, that primal instinct that often wakes you up at 3 a.m, a sentinel against unseen threats. And sure enough, the next morning, the silence in the house felt utterly wrong. It wasn't the usual morning quiet. It was an absence, a gaping hole. I went downstairs, made my coffee, the familiar ritual, a small comfort, and walked toward the garage. The side door, the one I had locked with the deadbolt, was now unlocked. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drum against my chest. I pushed the door open slowly, dread pooling in my stomach. The spot where my Shelby Mustang had sat for 40 years was empty, just a clean rectangle of concrete where the car used to be, and a small, almost imperceptible oil stain. I didn't scream. I didn't collapse. I walked back into the kitchen, my steps measured, precise. Brandon was sitting at the breakfast nook, eating a bowl of Lucky Charms as if it were a normal Tuesday. Abigail was scrolling idly on her tablet, ignoring the sudden tension in the room. "Where is my car?" I asked, my voice low, controlled, devoid of emotion. Brandon didn't even bother to look up. "I told you, Harry. I took it in for service. I did you a favor." Woke up early, saw the tires looked a little low, and thought, "Let me help the old guy out. It's at the shop." "Which shop?" I pressed, my gaze unblinking. "Give me the number." "Oh, it's a guy in Chicago. Don't worry about it. I'll handle all the paperwork. You just relax. You have enough on your plate. Grieving your mom and all." He waved a dismissive hand. I looked at him, at the way he meticulously avoided my eyes. I looked at Abigail, who was suddenly intensely fascinated by her screen. I walked back upstairs to my bedroom and opened the drawer. The keys to the Mustang were still there, exactly where I had left them. Brandon hadn't taken the car with the keys. He had hot-wired it, or he had forced the ignition. He hadn't taken it to a reputable shop. You don't steal a classic car at 5 a.m. to take it to a service center without the owner's permission. He had sold it, or he was stripping it for parts. He had stolen my property right from under my nose and lied to my face, using my age as a shield, thinking I was too forgetful to remember if I had given him permission or not. I stood by the window, looking out at the empty driveway, the morning sun mocking the void where my beloved car once stood. A cold, hard resolve, sharper than any blade, settled deep in my chest. They thought they were dealing with a grieving, confused old pensioner, an easy mark. They thought they had just taken a toy away from a child, but they had just committed grand theft auto, a felony in this state. They had just crossed the line from ungrateful, selfish children to outright criminals. I didn't call the Willow Creek Police Department. Not yet. The police would likely just call it a civil dispute, a family squabble. They'd say, "He's your son-in-law, mister. Sterling. He says he's helping you." No, I needed more. If I was going to take them down, I needed undeniable proof, a case so airtight it would withstand any challenge. I needed to let them think they were winning, to dig their own graves deeper. I closed the drawer, my movements slow, deliberate. I went back downstairs and sat opposite Brandon at the breakfast nook. "Thank you, Brandon," I said, forcing my voice to sound weak, defeated, barely above a whisper. "I suppose you're right. My eyes aren't what they used to be. Maybe it is better if I don't drive." Brandon smirked at Abigail, a triumphant, conspiratorial glance. "See, I told you he'd understand." They exchanged a look of pure, unadulterated triumph. They thought I had surrendered. They had no idea that I had just declared war. And the Mustang, that beautiful, powerful machine, was merely the first casualty. The unsettling silence of the house didn't last long. It was swiftly replaced by the frantic, chaotic energy of an occupation. That's precisely what this was. It was not a loving family moving in to care for an elderly relative. It was an occupation force, seizing territory, piece by agonizing piece. The next casualty, after my cherished car, was my last direct link to humanity within these walls. Mrs. Rodriguez. She had been our housekeeper for 30 years, a quiet, dignified woman who was more family than employee. She had meticulously ironed my judicial robes when I was first sworn in to the federal bench. She had held Eleanor's hand when the chemotherapy made her too weak to stand, offering quiet comfort and strength. She wasn't just staff. She was the keeper of this house's history, the silent witness to our joys and sorrows. But to Abigail and Brandon, she was precisely that, a witness. And witnesses, in their chilling calculus, needed to be eliminated. It happened in the library, a room that once held so much quiet gravitas. I was sitting in my worn leather armchair, pretending to stare vacantly at a specific spot on the wall, a performance of senility I was perfecting hour by hour. Abigail stormed in, her designer heels clicking aggressively on the polished hardwood floor, the sound a percussive announcement of her fury. She was holding a tarnished silver spoon, one of the antique pieces from Eleanor's grandmother's precious set, a family heirloom. Mrs. Rodriguez followed her, looking small, terrified, twisting her floral apron in her hands like a worried child. "You're stealing from us!" Abigail shrieked, her voice shrill, theatrical, designed to shock and intimidate. "I found this in your bag! Don't you dare lie to me!" Mrs. Rodriguez was trembling, her usually steady hands now shaking uncontrollably. "Miss Abigail, I would never. I was polishing them, I swear. I must have put it in my pocket by mistake when the phone rang. I have worked here for 30 years. Mr. Arthur knows me." Her eyes, usually full of quiet strength, now pleaded with me, desperate for the man she knew, the man who had always defended her, to step forward and intervene. "Mr. Arthur, please tell her." I gripped the armrests of my chair, every fiber of my being screaming for me to stand up, to use my courtroom voice. The voice that had silenced hardened mob bosses and corrupt senators alike, and order my daughter to get out of my house. I wanted to tell Mrs. Rodriguez that she was untouchable, that she was family, not disposable staff. But I couldn't. Not yet. If I showed strength now, if I revealed my true faculties, they would be on guard. They would cover their tracks, destroy any lingering evidence. To catch them, to truly bring them to justice, I had to remain the victim. I had to let them believe I was completely gone. I looked at Mrs. Rodriguez, forcing my eyes to appear glassy, unfocused, confused. "Who is stealing?" I mumbled, my voice trembling with a feigned frailty. "Where is Eleanor? Eleanor will sort it out." Abigail let out a huff of triumph, a sneering sound of satisfaction. "Mom is dead, Dad. Remember? You're confused again. See? He doesn't even know what day it is." She spun back to Mrs. Rodriguez, her face twisting into a cruel sneer. "You're fired. Get your things and get out now, or I call the police." Mrs. Rodriguez began to sob, a broken, devastating sound that tore at my heart. She didn't argue. She knew who held the perceived power now. She turned to leave, her shoulders slumped in utter defeat. "Wait," I said. It came out softer than I intended, but it stopped them. I struggled to stand up, leaning heavily on my cane, feigning a noticeable tremor in my legs. I want to say goodbye." Abigail rolled her eyes, a gesture of pure exasperation. "Fine, make it quick. She's a thief, Dad. Don't let her touch you." I shuffled over to Mrs. Rodriguez. She looked at me with such profound pity, such deep sadness. She truly believed I was lost, that I had abandoned her. I pulled her into a clumsy old man's hug, a carefully orchestrated movement. As I did, I slipped my hand into her apron pocket. I had been carrying a check for $10,000, drawn from an old obscure account Abigail didn't yet know about, and a small, folded note. For 2 days, knowing this precise moment would come. I leaned in close, my mouth near her ear. Under the pretense of a confused, barely audible whisper, I spoke with absolute clarity, my voice cutting through the charade. Take the money. Call the number on the paper. Do not speak to anyone else. Wait for my signal. I trust you. I felt her stiffen, a subtle reaction. She pulled back slightly, looking into my eyes, and for a fleeting second, she saw it then. The spark, the intelligence, the clarity. She realized the lights were still very much on. She blinked, wiping away her tears, and gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. Goodbye, Mr. Arthur, she said, her voice now steady, imbued with a newfound strength. Now you take care of yourself. She walked out with her head held high, leaving Abigail momentarily stunned. Abigail slammed the door behind her, locking it with a satisfying, decisive click. That's better, she declared, dusting off her hands as if she had just taken out the trash. Now we can get some people in here who we can actually trust. People who know their place. Phase 1 of isolation was complete. Phase 2 began even before lunch. Brandon walked into the living room, a bundle of cables clutched in his hand. He wore a fake, toothy smile plastered on his face, the kind a used car salesman wears when he knows the transmission is about to blow. Hey, Harry, he boomed, his voice cheerful and artificially loud. I was thinking, all this noise, the phone ringing, the news, the internet. It's too much stress for you. The doctor said you need peace, quiet. So I did you a favor. He held up the cables. They were the cords to every single landline phone in the house. Every last one. I disconnected the home phones, he continued, a performative helpfulness in his tone. No more telemarketers bothering you. And I changed the Wi-Fi password. You don't need to be staring at screens all day. It's bad for your brain. We need to focus on your rest. He wasn't suggesting it. He was informing me. He had severed my lines of communication with the outside world. He had turned my own home into a hermetically sealed bunker. But what if I need to call someone? I stammered, trying to sound pathetic, confused. What if I need help? Brandon patted my shoulder, a gesture that felt less like comfort and more like ownership. That's what we're here for, Harry. You need something, you ask us. We're your connection now. You don't need to talk to anyone else. Who would you call anyway? All your friends are dead or retired. We're your family. We're all you have. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. He was smiling while he systematically suffocated me, isolating me from everything familiar. He was telling me I was a prisoner, all for my own good. I looked at the cables in his hand, a symbol of my forced solitude. He thought he had cut me off. He didn't know about the burner phone, a simple prepaid flip phone I had taped inside the air vent in the master bathroom. He didn't know about the old laptop I had hidden under the floorboards in the attic, powered by a discreet solar charger. He thought he was the warden, the master of my fate. He didn't realize he was locked in here with me, trapped in my meticulously planned revenge. Thank you, Brandon, I said, lowering my head, forcing my voice to sound subservient. You're right. The ringing, it hurts my head. Good man, he said, patting my back condescendingly. Now go rest. Dinner will be ready soon. Dinner. That was the final indignity of the day. A meticulously crafted psychological assault. The smell hit me first, even before I entered the dining room. It was rich, savory, rosemary, garlic, the searing fat of prime beef. It was the unmistakable aroma of a perfect ribeye steak, cooked to succulent perfection. My stomach growled, a hollow, aching protest. I hadn't eaten a proper meal, a meal with dignity since Eleanor's funeral. I walked into the dining room. The table was set beautifully, ostentatiously. Crystal glasses, Eleanor's finest china, gleaming silver cutlery. Abigail and Brandon were already seated, and in front of them were two massive, perfectly seared steaks, juices running onto the pristine white porcelain. A bottle of my best Cabernet Sauvignon, a vintage I had been saving for a special occasion, was already open on the table, half empty. I sat down at my usual spot, at the head of the table, the seat of the patriarch. But there was no plate for me. Instead, there was a small plastic bowl. Inside was a gray, lumpy sludge. It looked like oatmeal that had been made with dirty dishwater, congealed and unappetizing. "What is this?" I asked, pointing a shaking finger at the bowl, my voice barely a whisper. Abigail cut a piece of her steak, putting it in her mouth and chewing slowly, savoring every bite, her eyes on me. "Oh, Dad, we read up on your condition. With your confusion and the stress, swallowing can be difficult. We don't want you to choke. It's an aspiration risk." She offered a saccharine smile, devoid of any genuine warmth. I stared at her. My swallowing was perfectly fine. I had eaten a hearty sandwich yesterday when they weren't looking, savoring every bite. "This is porridge," she said, swallowing her steak with a theatrical relish. "It's fortified. It has all the nutrients you need. It's easier for you to digest. You don't want to get sick, do you?" Brandon took a long, greedy sip of my wine, his eyes fixed on mine. "It's for your own good, Harry. Steak is tough. You have old teeth. Eat up. It'll make you strong." I looked at the gray sludge. Then I looked at the gleaming steak on their plates. This wasn't about health. This wasn't about care. This was about dominance, about control. They were reducing me to an infant, stripping away the last shreds of my dignity, forcing me to watch them feast on my wealth, my legacy, while I ate slop, a disgusting gruel. They wanted me to break. They wanted me to beg. Or worse, they wanted me to get angry, to throw the bowl, to prove I was unstable so they could call the doctors they had no doubt already primed. I picked up the spoon. My hand trembled, not from age, but from a rage so hot it felt like it was burning my throat, searing my esophagus. I forced the spoon into the sludge. I lifted it to my mouth. It tasted like wet cardboard and bitter shame. I swallowed it. I took another bite, and another. I ate every single bite of that vile gruel while they watched, smirking, talking casually about the renovations they were planning for the kitchen, the new appliances, the marble countertops. I kept my eyes on the bowl, allowing no emotion, no flicker of my true thoughts to show in my gaze. I needed fuel. Even garbage fuel was fuel. I needed strength for what was coming. After dinner, they sent me to bed like a naughty child. "Go rest, Dad," Abigail said, her tone dripping with false concern. "We have friends coming over to celebrate the move. You need your sleep." I climbed the grand staircase, my cane thumping rhythmically, a slow, deliberate cadence that echoed in the silence. I went into my room and closed the door. I didn't turn on the light. I lay on the bed, fully clothed, staring at the ceiling, my mind a whirlwind of cold fury. Downstairs, the music started. I heard the festive pop of champagne corks. I heard laughter, not just Brandon and Abigail's, but the boisterous sounds of others. They were throwing a party on the very day they had fired my loyal housekeeper, stolen my priceless car, and fed me slop. They were having a housewarming party in a house they didn't even own yet. "To the new owners!" I heard Brandon shout, his voice slurred with alcohol booming from the floorboards below. A chorus of drunken cheers followed. "This place is amazing!" a stranger's voice yelled. "What about the old man?" "Don't worry about him." Abigail's voice floated up through the floorboards, shrill and tipsy. "He's out of it. He'll be in a home within the month. Then we can really redo this place. The money is basically ours already." I lay there in the dark, listening to them toast my demise, their greedy laughter echoing in the hollow chambers of my heart. They were celebrating their premature victory, drunk on avarice and hubris. They thought the game was over. They had no idea the game had just begun. I reached under the mattress and pulled out a small, black notebook. I turned on a penlight, shielding the glow with my hand. A silent, meticulous archivist. I wrote down everything. The exact date and time. The unjust firing of Mrs. Rodriguez. The theft of the silver spoon. The cutting of the phone lines. The calculated withholding of proper food. The callous celebration downstairs. Every single insult. Every lie. Every stolen dollar. It was all going into the record. A detailed ledger of their crimes. They were diligently building their dream life, but they were laying the very foundation on a landmine of their own making. And I, Arthur Sterling, was the one holding the detonator. "Sleep well, children," I whispered into the oppressive darkness of my room. "Enjoy the party, because the hangover is going to be fatal." The insidious fog in my brain wasn't natural. I knew the aches of 72 years, the subtle way rain settled into my knees, the fleeting moments when a name might slip just out of reach. But this was different. This was a lead weight pressing down on my frontal lobe, a suffocating gray blanket that wrapped around my consciousness the moment I opened my eyes. I found myself sleeping 18 hours a day, a profound, unnatural lethargy. My hands, which had once signed federal warrants without a tremor, were now shaking so violently I couldn't even hold a pen steady enough to do the simple crossword puzzle, a daily ritual Eleanor and I had shared. Abigail would sit on the edge of my bed, smoothing the duvet with a look of practiced concern that never quite reached her eyes. "Dad, you're getting worse," she would whisper, her voice dripping with a sickly sweetness. "You forgot to eat lunch again." You're staring at the wall. "We're so worried. It's the grief, Dad. It's eating you alive." I hadn't forgotten lunch. I had deliberately skipped it because the soup, a thin, watery broth, smelled metallic, like copper pennies. But the constant gaslighting, the relentless psychological warfare, was slowly eroding my defenses. Was I truly losing it? Was this the dreaded slide into darkness everyone feared? The inevitable decline of age? The self-doubt, a new, unwelcome companion, began to creep in. Then came the expert. It was a humid Tuesday afternoon, the kind of oppressive Midwestern summer day that makes the air feel thick and heavy. I was bundled in a blanket in the sunroom, fighting a crushing, almost irresistible urge to close my eyes, to surrender to the unnatural drowsiness. Brandon walked in, his footsteps heavy, followed by a man I had never seen before. "Dad!" Brandon boomed, his voice too loud, too cheerful for the small, quiet room. "This is Dr. Miles Corbin. He's a specialist. We called him for a house call, since getting you to the car has been such a struggle lately." I lifted my heavy head, forcing my leaden eyelids open to examine this so-called specialist. In my 40 years on the bench, I had learned to read a man, not by what he presented, but by the details he forgot to hide. Dr. Corbin wore a white coat, but it was ill-fitting, yellowed at the collar, clearly not his own, or at least not clean. He wouldn't meet my gaze, his eyes darting to my chin, my shoulder, the window, never my eyes. But it was his shoes that truly condemned him. They were expensive loafers, yes, but the leather was scuffed raw at the toes, and there was dried mud caked thick around the heels. A high-end geriatric specialist making house calls in an exclusive Willow Creek estate does not walk through mud. He also smelled faintly of stale tobacco and nervous sweat, a toxic combination. "Mr. Sterling," Dr. Corbin said, reaching for my wrist. His hands were clammy, cold. "Let's just check those vitals." The examination was a complete farce. He listened to my heart for precisely 3 seconds through a thick wool sweater, a medical impossibility. He flashed a pen light across my face so fast he couldn't possibly have checked my pupil response. He asked nothing of my medical history, my diet, my pain levels, my mental state. He stood up abruptly, turning to Abigail and Brandon, already having prepared his verdict. "It is, as I suspected," he announced, pulling a prescription pad from his pocket, the paper visibly crumpled. "Rapid onset dementia, likely aggravated by the trauma of your wife's passing. It's aggressive. We need to manage the symptoms immediately to prevent violent outbursts." Violent outbursts? I was barely strong enough to lift my head. "Is there a cure?" Abigail asked, clasping her hands, her performance of concern still on point. "No cure," Corbin said, shaking his head. "Just management. I'm prescribing a specialized sedative. It will keep him calm. It's a custom compound. Very effective." He reached into his battered medical bag and pulled out a plain orange bottle. No pharmacy label, no dosage instructions, no patient information, just a bottle of small, bright blue pills. "This feels highly irregular, doctor," I rasped, trying to sound as feeble as possible, yet injecting a subtle hint of my legal mind. "Where is the label?" Brandon stepped between me and the doctor, pushing me gently back into the chair, his tone firm. "Don't agitate yourself, Harry. The doctor knows best. This is concierge medicine. Only the best for you." "Doctor." Corbin practically fled the room as if the police were at the door, clearly uncomfortable with my questions. I heard them whispering in the hallway, the faint rustle of paper, the unmistakable sound of money changing hands. When Brandon returned, he held a glass of water and one of the blue pills. "Time for your medicine, Harry," he said, his smile forced. I looked at the pill. It was the color of antifreeze. My instincts screamed. This wasn't medicine. This was a sentence, a slow, insidious death. If I took this, I would never truly wake up. Not really. I would become the zombie they claimed I was, the invalid who couldn't recognize his own name. But if I refused, they would force it. Or worse, they would call the authorities and claim I was dangerous, using Corbin's fraudulent diagnosis to commit me, to truly erase me. I took the pill with a shaking hand, a trembling performance. I placed it on my tongue. I took a large gulp of water. "Good man," Brandon said, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction. I swallowed the water, but I skillfully slid the pill under my tongue, tucking it into the soft pocket of flesh against my cheek. It was a trick I learned from a drug mule witness back in '95, a desperate maneuver in a gritty federal courtroom. It burned, a bitter, acrid taste against my gums. "I feel tired," I mumbled, letting my eyelids droop. "It works fast," Brandon said, checking his watch, a triumphant gleam in his eyes. "Go to sleep, old man." He left the room, the door clicking shut behind him. I waited until his heavy footsteps faded, the house settling back into its oppressive silence. I shuffled to the corner of the room where Eleanor's favorite plant stood. A sansevieria, a snake plant. Almost indestructible, resilient. "I'm sorry, Eleanor," I whispered, my heart aching. I spat the dissolving blue pill into my handkerchief. I crushed it into a fine powder and mixed it with water from my bedside carafe. Then I poured the toxic slurry into the soil of the snake plant. If it was just a sedative, a mild relaxant, as Corbin claimed, the plant would be fine, maybe a little droopy. If it was poison, the truth would be undeniable. I spent the next 3 days playing the part. I flushed the subsequent pills down the toilet, a defiant act of rebellion. I slurred my speech, pretended to forget names, let them talk about selling the house right in front of me. A painful charade. But my eyes, though seemingly vacant, were always on the plant. On the first day, the tips of the rigid green leaves turned a sickly yellow. On the second day, the stalks began to visibly sag, losing their proud stiffness. By the morning of the third day, the plant was undeniably dead. It wasn't just dead, it was destroyed. The leaves had turned a slimy, necrotic black. They had collapsed into a putrid rot that smelled faintly of sulfur. The chemical had liquefied the cellular structure from the inside out. I stared at the black ruin. My hands, for the first time in days, stopped shaking. The fog, the creeping self-doubt, was gone, replaced by a cold, diamond-hard clarity. They weren't just drugging me, they were killing me. Slowly, insidiously. Organ failure. Dr. Corbin, the fake neurologist, would sign the death certificate, and it would all look natural. I looked at the black leaves. That was my liver they were targeting. That was my kidneys. I heard footsteps approaching. Abigail. I quickly threw a newspaper over the dead plant and slumped in my wheelchair, my mouth slightly agape, feigning unconsciousness. "Dad, you okay?" She called from the doorway, her voice tinged with impatience. I grunted, a guttural, confused sound. She wrinkled her nose. "Smells like something died in here." She left, dismissing it. I waited. Then I took a photo of the dead plant with my burner phone. I carefully bagged the soil and the necrotic leaves. This wasn't waste. This was evidence. This was attempted murder. The gavel was awake, and court was about to be in session. The first 24 hours without the blue pills were a descent into a private kind of hell. My body, deprived of the chemical leash it had been forced to wear, rebelled with a violence that terrified me. I lay in my bed, sweat soaking through the sheets, my muscles seizing in microscopic spasms that felt like electric shocks running just beneath the skin. My heart hammered a frantic, irregular rhythm against my ribs, a trapped bird desperate for freedom. I wanted to scream, to claw at the walls, to give in to the primal urge to fight the agony, but I lay still, resolute. I forced my breathing to remain shallow and ragged, mimicking the decline they were so eager to see, the progression towards what they assumed would be my inevitable end. Abigail came in to check on me around noon. She didn't bring food. She just stood at the foot of the bed, watching my trembling hands clutching the blanket. "He's fading fast," she whispered into her phone, turning slightly away from me, her voice devoid of genuine sorrow. "The doctor said the progression would be rapid, but this is efficient." A chilling pause. "Yes, I'll call Slick Sam Periwinkle the realtor today." She thought I was dying. She didn't realize that for the first time in weeks, I was actually, truly waking up. The withdrawal was pure agony, yes, but through the pain, the suffocating fog was lifting, dissipating like morning mist. The edges of the room, which had been soft and blurry for days, were sharpening into acute focus. I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator downstairs. I could smell the distinct, cloying scent of Abigail's expensive perfume lingering in the hallway. My mind, that intricate legal machine, was coming back online, rebooting system by system, and it was ravenous for justice. I waited until the late afternoon for my crucial window of opportunity. Brandon had a routine. At precisely 4 o'clock, after his exhausting day of spending my money and playing video games in my living room, he took a shower. A long, steamy shower. He liked to sing loudly, badly, his off-key warbling a predictable signal. As soon as I heard the plumbing groan and the first terrible notes begin, I threw off the covers. My legs were weak, rubbery, but adrenaline, that primal fuel, is a powerful motivator. I grabbed the plastic baggie from my hiding spot, inside the hollowed-out bedpost. Inside was the soil sample, the necrotic leaves of Eleanor's snake plant, and a handwritten note I had scrawled with a shaking hand during the night. The note contained specific names, dates, the chemical taste of the pills, and a clear directive for my trusted ally. I moved to the window. It opened onto the side garden, conveniently obscured from the street by a high, overgrown hedge. At 72, climbing out a window is not a graceful act. I scraped my shin on the frame, tore my pajama sleeve, and landed in the mulch with a heavy thud that knocked the wind clean out of me. I froze, listening. Brandon was still singing, blissfully unaware. I crawled on my hands and knees toward the old oak tree at the very back of the property. Eleanor and I had planted it 40 years ago, a sapling, a symbol of our growing life together. It was our anchor, our silent witness. Now, it would serve as my clandestine post office. I dug a shallow hole at the base of the trunk, using a silver spoon I had subtly swiped from my dinner tray days ago, a small act of defiance. The earth was cool and damp beneath my fingers. I carefully placed the plastic bag in the hole. I covered it with dirt, patted it down with practiced care, and scattered dead leaves over the spot to mask any disturbance. It looked natural, just another patch of ground in a slightly neglected garden. I didn't go back through the window. I couldn't risk the climb again. I slipped through the side door into the mudroom, moving like a ghost in my own home, a phantom haunting its rightful place. I needed to send the signal. I made my way to the basement. The air down there was cool, damp, and smelled of dust and old paper. It was the smell of my archives, boxes of case files, legal precedents, and judicial opinions I had kept from my years on the bench. Abigail and Brandon never came down here. It was too dark, too dirty, too devoid of their preferred marble and gilded light. I walked to the utility panel in the far corner. I pried open the metal casing, my fingers surprisingly nimble. Taped to the inside was a Nokia brick phone, a relic from the early 2000s. I had kept it charged, kept it prepaid. Paranoia, Eleanor used to call it. Preparation, I had corrected her. Always. I turned it on. The battery indicator glowed full. I dialed a number I knew by heart, a number burned into my memory from 2 decades ago. It rang twice. Law Office of Sarah Jenkins. A sharp, professional voice answered. I didn't identify myself. I didn't say hello. I spoke in a code we had established 2 decades ago, when she was my brilliant young clerk, and we were dealing with credible threats from a vengeful cartel. "The docket is full, Sarah," I rasped, my voice still a little rough from disuse, but firm. "We have a motion to dismiss on the grounds of toxicity. Evidence is filed at the Oak. The client is compromised." There was a pause, a silence that lasted 2 heartbeats, An eternity. Then Sarah's voice changed. It lost its administrative polish and became steel, sharp and unwavering. Understood, Your Honor. Is the client secure? Negative. Hostile environment. Immediate action required. I will draft the writ. Stay low. The line went dead. I turned off the phone and carefully taped it back inside the panel. My hands were shaking again, but this time from sheer exertion, not weakness. I had done it. The cavalry was coming. I turned to leave the basement, but I froze. The stairs creaked. Someone was opening the door at the top of the stairs. Light flooded down, blinding me in the gloom. "Dad?" Abigail's voice echoed down the stairwell, sharp and suspicious. "What on earth are you doing down there?" Panic flared in my chest. A cold, sharp claw. If she found the phone, if she realized I was mobile and coherent, the game was over. They would increase the dosage. They would restrain me. I slumped my shoulders. I let my jaw go slack. I turned slowly, shuffling my feet, looking not at her, but at a dark, empty corner of the room. "Here, Kitty! Kitty!" I mumbled, my voice trembling with a pathetic, confused hope. "Whiskers, are you down here, boy? Come here, Whiskers. Daddy has some milk." Abigail sighed, a sound of pure exasperation, heavy with disdain. She walked down 2 steps, peering into the darkness. "Dad, Whiskers died 5 years ago. You know that." I looked up at her, letting tears well in my eyes, forcing a heartbreakingly confused expression. "No, no. I heard him. He's hungry." Eleanor said. "He's hungry. Where is Eleanor? She needs to feed the cat." Abigail shook her head, her face twisting in disgust. "You're losing your mind, old man. Mom is dead. The cat is dead. There's nobody down here but you and the dust. Come upstairs before you fall and break a hip. I don't have time to take you to the ER today." She turned and walked back up, leaving the door open, a small victory. I stood there for a moment, letting the mask fall. I wiped the tears from my eyes. Whiskers had been a good cat. He was serving me, even from beyond the grave. I shuffled up the stairs, back to my prison, back to the blue pills I would hide in my cheek, and back to the waiting game. They thought I was chasing ghosts. They didn't know the ghost was hunting them. The hours between the dead drop at the old oak tree in the middle of the night were an excruciating exercise in patience. I lay in my bed, listening to the house settle, my body screaming for the sedatives I had denied it. The tremors were worse now, a constant low-frequency vibration in my hands and legs that made the bed frame rattle if I didn't tense every muscle to control it. But I welcomed the pain. The pain was real. The pain was clarity. It was a constant, brutal reminder of why I was fighting, why I had to endure. Around midnight, a new sound drifted up from the floorboards below. It wasn't the boisterous, drunken partying of the previous night. It was the low, murmured arguing of conspirators who were starting to feel the intense pressure of their own timeline. I needed to know what they were saying. I needed to know the state of the battlefield, the evolving threats. I forced myself up. My joints popped loudly in the silence of the room, like dry twigs snapping. I froze, waiting for a reaction, but none came. I slipped on my wool socks, the same ones I used for my late-night patrols during the big mafia trials of the 90 seconds, when insomnia was my constant companion. I moved to the door and eased it open, inch by agonizing inch. The hallway was dark, save for a sliver of light coming from the kitchen downstairs. I didn't go to the stairs immediately. I moved down the hall to the guest room, the one they had brazenly claimed as their new master suite. The door was ajar, the room empty. They were downstairs. This was my chance to see the physical evidence of their occupation, their pillaging. I slipped inside their room. It smelled of stale perfume, cheap cologne, and a pervasive, unmistakable scent of greed. My eyes adjusted to the gloom, and my heart sank. The room was a disaster zone of my possessions, Eleanor's possessions. On the dresser, Abigail had piled Eleanor's jewelry boxes. Not the costume jewelry she wore for errands, but the velvet boxes from the secure safe, a safe I thought I had hidden well enough behind a loose panel in the study. I walked over, my steps silent on the thick carpet. I opened the top box. It was empty. Eleanor's pearl necklace, the one I bought her for our 30th anniversary, was gone. I opened another. Her diamond tennis bracelet. Gone. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in my chest. I looked around the room, my gaze frantic. On the bedside table, next to a half-empty bottle of cheap wine, was a stack of pink slips. Pawn shop receipts. I picked them up, my hands shaking with a rage so profound it almost blinded me. Fast Cash Pawn on 4th Street, a grimy establishment in a less than reputable part of the city. They hadn't even bothered to take them to a reputable appraiser or an auction house where they might get fair value. They had pawned my dead wife's heirlooms, irreplaceable family treasures, for quick, dirty cash at a strip mall fence. The dates on the receipts were from 3 days ago, the very day Dr. Corbin, the fake doctor, had arrived. They were liquidating the assets, stripping the house bare to pay for the poison. I memorized the address. I memorized the ticket numbers. I would get them back. I would burn down the pawn shop, legally speaking, if I had to, but I would get them back. I put the receipts back exactly as I found them, every detail meticulously restored. I turned to leave, but something under the bed caught my eye. A heavy metal briefcase. It wasn't mine. It was Brandon's. I knelt down, my old knees protesting on the hard floor. The case was locked, a simple 3-digit tumbler. Brandon, I knew, was not a complex man. I tried the first combination that came to mind, a number he often used as a password for his various online gambling accounts. 777. The slot machine jackpot. The latch clicked open with a soft, satisfying sound. I lifted the lid. Inside, there were no papers, no business documents. There was cash, stacks of it, rubber-banded rolls of $100 bills. It looked like $20,000, maybe $30,000. But next to the cash was something that made my blood run cold, chilling me to the bone. It was a gun, a snub nose. 38 Special. The serial number had been filed off. A clear sign of illicit activity. It was a throwaway piece, a burner gun, the kind used by low-level enforcers, desperate criminals, and those who operate outside the law. Why did my son-in-law, a failed real estate broker with a penchant for online gambling, have a deserialized weapon and 30 grand in untraceable cash under his bed? This wasn't just about greed anymore. This was about dangerous debt. This was the kind of trouble that didn't end with a civil lawsuit. It ended with a shallow grave, a missing persons report, or an unfortunate accident. They weren't just stealing from me to live the high life. They were stealing from me to pay off someone scary, someone who wouldn't accept excuses, someone like Salvatore Sal Moretti, a known loan shark from the city's rougher side. I closed the case and scrambled the lock, leaving it just as I had found it. I shoved it back under the bed. The entire narrative in my head shifted, hardening. I wasn't just fighting for my property, for my dignity. I was fighting for my life, against people who were backed into a corner by wolves and were willing to sacrifice anyone, including me, to save themselves. I left the room and crept to the top of the stairs. The voices from the kitchen were clearer now, tinged with desperation and fear. "He has to go this week," Brandon was saying, his voice tight with barely suppressed stress. Sal called again. He said the interest compounds daily. We need the house sale to clear before the end of the month, or they start breaking fingers. "It's not that simple, Brandon," Abigail hissed back, her voice taut. "The power of attorney has a waiting period, unless Dr. Corbin declares him incapacitated immediately." "Then call Corbin," Brandon snapped, his voice rising in frustration. "Tell him to up the dose. Make him a vegetable if you have to. I am not losing my kneecaps because your dad is taking too long to die." I gripped the banister, my knuckles turning white. They were accelerating the timeline. Sal. That was the name. Salvatore Moretti. A loan shark, indeed. Brandon was in deep, way over his head with a dangerous man, and I was his collateral, my life literally a bargaining chip. Suddenly, I heard the scrape of a chair against the kitchen floor, footsteps approaching the stairs. "I'm going up to check on him," Abigail said, her voice laced with suspicion. "I want to make sure he actually swallowed the pill tonight." I was exposed. I was 10 feet from my room, but the floorboard in front of my door, a quirk of this old house, groaned like a dying animal if you stepped on it wrong. I couldn't make it back in time without making noise, without revealing my active state. I looked around frantically. The linen closet, filled with Eleanor's pressed sheets and fragrant sachets, was 2 feet away. I pulled the door open, squeezed inside, and pulled it shut just as Abigail's shadow fell across the top of the stairs. I held my breath. The closet smelled of lavender sachets and mothballs, a comforting, familiar scent from a life they were trying to steal. I pressed myself against the shelves of neatly folded towels, praying my tremors wouldn't make the door rattle, praying she wouldn't hear the frantic pounding of my heart. Abigail walked past the closet. I could hear the swish of her silk robe. She stopped at my bedroom door. She opened it. Silence. She was looking at my empty bed. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird, a desperate tattoo. If she turned on the light, if she saw the bed was empty, the alarm would be raised. They would hunt me down. They would realize I was mobile, coherent, and the game would be irrevocably over. "Dad?" she whispered into the dark room. I didn't answer. I bit my tongue to keep from coughing, to suppress any sound. She stepped into the room. I heard the bathroom door open. "Dad, are you in there?" She was moving deeper into the room. This was my chance. I eased the closet door open. I slipped out into the hallway. I didn't run. Running makes noise. I flowed. I moved with the muscle memory of a man who used to sneak into the nursery to check on his sleeping daughter without waking her, a father's quiet ballet. I reached the threshold of my room just as she was coming out of the bathroom. I leaned heavily against the doorframe, letting my body sag, my eyes drooping half shut, a perfect picture of a confused, disoriented old man. "Abigail," I mumbled, slurring the words. "Is it morning?" She jumped, spinning around, putting a hand to her chest. "Jesus, Dad, you scared me. Where were you?" I blinked slowly, feigning deep confusion. "Water. Thirsty. Kitchen is too far. Got lost. Couldn't find it." She let out a breath of relief, but her eyes were still suspicious, analytical. "You were downstairs?" "No," I lied, pointing vaguely down the hall. "Bathroom. Wrong door. Dark. So dark." I let a little drool escape the corner of my mouth. I let my hand shake violently against the doorframe, leaning heavily. She bought it. The contempt in her eyes returned, replacing the suspicion. "You're wandering," she said, disgusted, her voice dripping with disdain. "Go back to bed. I'll get you water. Do not leave this room again." I shuffled back to the bed and climbed in, pulling the covers up to my chin. She watched me, her arms crossed. "You're a mess, Dad," she whispered, her voice cold. "A total mess." She left, closing the door firmly. I heard the lock click from the outside. She had locked me in. I lay in the dark, my heart rate slowly returning to normal. They had locked the door. That complicated things, yes, but they had forgotten one crucial detail. This was my house. I built it. I knew its secrets. Every creak, every hidden panel, every structural detail. The bedroom door had a lock, yes, but the hinges were on the inside, and I had a multi-tool, a compact, versatile device, in the pocket of my suit jacket, which was hanging neatly in the closet. I waited 10 minutes, until I heard them go into the guest room, their master suite, and the door closed firmly. Then I got up. I didn't go for the water. I went for the closet. I retrieved the multi-tool. It took me 3 minutes, working meticulously in the dark, to pop the hinge pins. I lifted the entire door out of the frame, setting it gently, silently, against the wall. I was free again. But now I had new damning information. Pawnshop receipts, a burner gun, a dangerous loan shark named Sal Moretti, and an accelerated deadline. They were desperate. Desperate people make mistakes, but desperate people are also exceptionally dangerous. I needed to secure the financial evidence tonight, before sunrise. I needed to hack Brandon's laptop, or at least access it. I looked at the open doorway. The hallway was clear. The house was silent again, a tense, watchful silence. I took a deep breath, steeling myself against the pain in my joints, the residual tremors. The investigation wasn't over. I had to go back into the belly of the beast. I had to get to the study. I moved into the hall, stepping over the threshold where the door used to be. A ghost in my own life, haunting the very people who tried to kill me. And ghosts, as they would soon learn, are very hard to catch. I reached the door to my study. It was closed, but not locked. Brandon was arrogant. He thought I was a drooling invalid, incapable of turning a doorknob, let alone navigating a complex financial investigation. I pushed the door open. The smell hit me first. It was the pungent scent of disrespect. Stale pepperoni pizza, cheap beer, and that cloying chemical body spray Brandon insisted on marinating himself in. My study, once a hallowed place of law and order, a sanctuary where I had written judicial opinions that changed federal precedents, now smelled like a fraternity house basement after a particularly raucous party. I walked to my desk. My beautiful hand-carved mahogany desk, a family heirloom, was cluttered with his garbage. Empty energy drink cans, a half-eaten sandwich left to fester. And there, sitting in the center, like a usurper's throne, was my laptop. I opened the lid. The screen flared to life, casting a ghostly blue light across the room. I squinted against the sudden brightness. It asked for a password. I didn't need to hack it. I didn't need a decryption key. I knew my enemy. Brandon was a simple man with simple vanities, and even simpler passwords. I typed in the 6 digits I knew would be there, a number he used for everything, 041283, Abigail's birthday, access granted. I didn't smile. There was no joy in being right about their utter predictability, their monumental stupidity. I navigated immediately to the browser. He hadn't even bothered to log out of the bank portal. The Sterling Family Trust dashboard was open, gleaming mockingly on the screen. I looked at the balance. It was significantly lower than it had been a month ago. I clicked on the transaction history. My eyes scanned the lines, looking for the hemorrhage, the bleed of my life savings. It didn't take long to find it. There were a series of transfers, all labeled with vague, professional-sounding codes. Medical consulting fees, geriatric care management, lifestyle audit services. The recipient for all of them was a company called J&V Consulting, LLC, Jared and Victoria. They weren't even trying to hide it, barely concealing their tracks. They had set up a shell company, a fraudulent front, and were funneling my life savings into it, pretending they were paying for my essential care. I clicked on the most recent transfer, dated just yesterday. $450,000. Nearly $500,000 siphoned out in a single keystroke. That wasn't just theft. That was grand larceny. That was wire fraud. That was a federal crime carrying a sentence of up to 20 years. I took a deep breath, steadying my hand, my mind now cold and precise. I needed more. I minimized the browser and opened his email client. The inbox was a disaster of spam, gaming newsletters, and dubious financial offers. But one subject line caught my eye. It was from a man named Slick Sam Periwinkle. I knew Slick Sam. He was a real estate broker who had lost his license twice for unethical practices, a bottom feeder. The subject line read, Urgent Sale, Willow Creek Property. I opened the thread. My blood ran cold as I read Brandon's words, dripping with desperation. Eddie, we need to move this fast. The old man is deteriorating quicker than we thought. We need the cash to finalize the LLC investments. List it for Trey, Oda. $3.8 million. My house. This estate, this sanctuary Eleanor and I had built, was appraised at $4.5 million just last year. They were willing to lose $700,000, almost $750,000, just to dump the asset quickly. They wanted the cash liquid before I died, or before anyone started asking inconvenient questions. I read Slick Sam's reply. 3.8 is a steal, Brandy. I can have a buyer in 24 hours at that price. But what about the resident? We can't do showings with a senile old man wandering around in his pajamas. Brandon's response was the smoking gun, the irrefutable evidence. It was the sentence that would seal his fate. And Abigail's, don't worry about the resident. He's going to Sunny Meadows next week. We're finalizing the paperwork for the involuntary commitment tomorrow. He won't be a problem by the time you bring the buyers. Sunny Meadows. It wasn't a retirement community. It wasn't a place of dignified care. It was a state-funded warehouse for the indigent, the forgotten, the unwanted. It was a place where people went to rot in urine-soaked sheets, abandoned by their families. They had stolen nearly $500,000 of my money, sold my cherished car, and were now selling my home for pennies on the dollar. A massive loss of equity. Yet, they were planning to dump me in the cheapest, filthiest hole they could find. A place that cost less than their monthly car lease. All to save a few grand a month on my care. The cruelty was absolute. It was efficient. It was sociopathic. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a micro USB drive. It was small, silver, and utterly unassuming. I plugged it into the side of the laptop. My hand hovered over the trackpad. I selected everything. The bank statements, the transfer receipts to J&V Consulting, the incriminating email thread with Slick Sam, the draft of the guardianship application they were planning to file. I dragged the files to the external drive. The progress bar appeared, a thin, green line slowly filling up the screen. Copying items. Time remaining, 30 seconds. It felt like 30 years. I stood in the ghostly blue glow of the screen, my ears straining for any sound from the hallway. If Brandon woke up for a glass of water, if Abigail got up to use the bathroom, if they caught me here standing tall, operating a computer, saving damning evidence, the charade would be irrevocably over. They would realize I wasn't senile. And then, they would get truly desperate. Dr. Corbin would come back with a stronger dose, or perhaps a pillow. 10 seconds. The floorboard in the hallway creaked, groaning under a heavy weight. I froze. The sound was unmistakable. Someone was moving. 5 seconds. I heard the rustle of fabric. A cough. Brandon. 0 seconds. Complete. I yanked the USB drive out. I closed the laptop lid, wiping the surface with my sleeve to remove any fingerprints. I didn't have time to arrange the pizza boxes back exactly how they were. I just had to hope he was too hungover, too oblivious, to notice. I moved to the door, pressing my ear against the wood. The footsteps were heavy, clumsy. They were moving toward the bathroom, not the study. The toilet flushed. The water ran for a second. Then the heavy footsteps returned to the bedroom. The bed springs groaned. The snoring resumed. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. I slipped out of the study and glided back to my room, a shadow in my own house. I went into my private bathroom, a small, tiled space. It was the only place I had left that felt somewhat secure, mostly because Abigail refused to enter it, claiming it smelled like old people. I lifted the heavy porcelain lid of the toilet tank. It was cool to the touch. I took a piece of waterproof duct tape from my pocket. I taped the tiny silver USB drive to the underside of the lid, high up where the water wouldn't touch it. I lowered the lid carefully, ensuring it made no sound as it settled back onto the ceramic tank. It was done. I had the poison, the clear intent to murder. I had the financial trail, the blatant embezzlement. I had the intent to sell my home for a pittance. I had the conspiracy to commit elder abuse and fraud. I looked at myself in the mirror above the sink. My reflection was gaunt. My silver hair was wild, disheveled. I looked like a madman, a man on the edge. But the eyes staring back at me were cold and hard, clear and resolute. They wanted to put me in Sunny Meadows next week. They wanted to sell my sanctuary for a quick payout, to feed their gambling debts and their insatiable greed. They wanted to erase Arthur Sterling. I walked back to my bed and climbed in. I pulled the covers up to my chin. I stared at the ceiling, waiting for the sun to rise. I wouldn't sleep tonight. I didn't need sleep. I needed to rehearse. Tomorrow they would bring the papers. Tomorrow they would try to trick me into signing away my life, my legacy. I closed my eyes and smiled in the dark. Let them come. I had a surprise for them. The trap was set. The evidence was secure. And the judge, the gavel, was ready to deliver his verdict. They thought they were the predators. They had no idea they were locked in a cage with a lion. End of chapter. The morning sun filtered through the heavy curtains of the master bedroom, casting long, dust-mote-filled beams across the polished hardwood floor. It should have been a beautiful day, the kind Eleanor and I would have spent drinking coffee on the patio, watching the cardinals nest in the old oak tree. Instead, the air in the room felt stagnant and heavy, charged with a predatory anticipation, a chilling quiet before the storm. I sat in my wheelchair by the window, a prop they had insisted on buying from a second-hand medical supply store to further their narrative of my rapid decline. I didn't need it, but I sat in it, letting my head loll to the side, my mouth slightly open, waiting for the final, cruel performance to begin. At 9 sharp, the door opened with a soft click. Abigail walked in. She wasn't wearing her usual loungewear. She was dressed in a sharp business suit, a dark power blazer and skirt, her blonde hair pulled back in a severe, no-nonsense bun. She looked like she was going to a crucial board meeting, or perhaps a hostile takeover. In her hand, she carried a thick manila envelope and a formidable black fountain pen. Brandon hovered in the doorway behind her, his arms crossed, his eyes darting nervously around the room, as if checking for invisible witnesses, for hidden cameras. "Good morning, Dad," Abigail said, her voice artificially bright, too loud, the way one speaks to a child or a simpleton. "We have some good news. I found a new insurance plan for you. Better coverage, better doctors. We just need to get the paperwork out of the way so we can enroll you today." She placed the stack of papers on the small table in front of me. I looked down at them through half-closed eyelids. The top page was, indeed, a generic medical history form, something innocuous, easily dismissed. But the edges of the papers underneath were slightly misaligned, revealing a glimpse of the bold, capitalized font peeking out from the second page. Durable power of attorney, revocation of prior directives, asset control authorization. These weren't insurance forms. This was a complete surrender of my legal existence, my autonomy. If I signed these, Abigail would have the absolute power to sell my house, liquidate all my investments, empty my bank accounts, and make all medical decisions on my behalf, including, chillingly, the decision to cease care. It was a death warrant disguised as bureaucracy, a legal execution wrapped in red tape. "I need a pen," I mumbled, my words slurring together, a perfect imitation of a confused old man. "Here, Dad, use this one." Abigail uncapped the elegant fountain pen and pressed it into my right hand. My hand trembled. It wasn't entirely an act. The residue of the sedatives and the profound stress of the last few days had taken a toll, but I exaggerated the tremors, letting the pen wobble violently between my fingers. I lowered the nib to the crisp paper. "Just sign right there at the bottom," Abigail urged, tapping a perfectly manicured fingernail on the signature line, her impatience barely concealed. I tried. I really did. I dragged the pen across the paper, creating a jagged, ink-blotted line that looked nothing like a signature. It looked like a seismograph reading of a major earthquake, a chaotic scrawl. I let the pen slip from my fingers. It clattered onto the table, rolling across the document and leaving a smeared trail of black ink. "Oops," I whispered, forcing a pathetic, confused expression. "Dropped it." Abigail sighed. A sharp intake of breath through her nose, her patience wearing thin. She picked up the pen and wiped the ink off the page with her thumb, smearing it further. "It's okay, Dad. Just try again. Focus. Hold it tight." She jammed the pen back into my hand. This time, she wrapped her cold, firm fingers around mine, squeezing hard. Her skin was cold, her grip painful, her polished nails digging into the thin, delicate skin of my knuckles. "I'll help you," she said, her voice tight, strained with frustration. "We'll do it together." She began to force my hand to move, trying to guide me to write Arthur Sterling. This was it, the moment of truth. If I let her guide my hand, a forensic handwriting expert might later argue that I had assistance. Yes, but they could also argue that the intent was still there, that the signature was fundamentally mine. I couldn't let a legible signature, however coerced, appear on this document. I decided to escalate the chaos. I felt a tickle in my throat, summoned from the depths of my lungs, a powerful, involuntary spasm. I coughed, a dry, hacking cough, then another, louder. I convulsed in the wheelchair, jerking my arm back violently. The pen tore through the paper, a long, ugly rip right through the signature line of the durable power of attorney document. I dropped the pen again, hacking and wheezing, doubling over as if I couldn't breathe. A truly convincing performance of an old man losing control. "Oh, for God's sake," Brandon shouted from the doorway, his voice cracking with exasperation. "He ruined it." Abigail stared at the torn paper, her face going a deep, ugly red. The carefully constructed mask of the caring daughter dissolved completely, revealing the monstrous, avaricious individual underneath. She didn't ask if I was okay. She didn't get me water. She slammed her hand down on the table, making the lamp rattle, the crystal ornament tremble. "You useless old man!" she screamed, her voice raw, feral, echoing through the supposedly quiet room. The silence that followed was deafening. Shocked, I stopped coughing. I looked up at her, letting fear show in my eyes, though what I felt was a cold, burning satisfaction. She had said it. She had finally said what she had been thinking since the day of Eleanor's funeral. Abigail grabbed my shoulders and shook me, violently. "Sign it! Just sign the damn paper so we can be done with this. Sign it and die already so we can move on with our lives. Do you have any idea how exhausting this is? Waiting for you to just let go?" There it was, the naked truth, ugly and unadorned. Brandon stepped further into the room, a flicker of apprehension in his eyes. "Abby, calm down. He's looking at you." "I don't care," she spat, turning to grab a fresh copy of the document from her briefcase, which sat open on the floor. She had come prepared, anticipating my resistance. She slapped the new document down on the table. "Sign it," she hissed, leaning into my face, her breath hot and furious. "Or so help me God, I will have Dr. Corbin double the dose. I will have him put you in a coma, and I will guide your hand while you are unconscious. Do you understand me?" I shrank back into the wheelchair, making myself as small, as pathetic as possible. I needed to sign. If I didn't, they would follow through on the threat. They would overdose me, and the game would end prematurely, disastrously. I needed to survive to fight them in court, but I couldn't give them a valid signature. I reached for the pen, but this time, I didn't reach with my right hand. I reached with my left. "What are you doing?" Brandon asked, confusion warring with his anger. "Use your right hand." "Hurt?" I whimpered, clutching my right wrist where Abigail had dug her nails in, forcing a pained grimace. "It hurts. Can't hold." Abigail looked at my right hand. There were distinct red crescents where her nails had pierced the skin. A small, crimson drop of blood was forming, a clear physical manifestation of her violence. She flinched, perhaps realizing she had just left undeniable physical evidence of abuse, a crucial piece of the puzzle. "Fine," she snapped, exasperated. "Use the left. Just make a mark. Anything." I took the pen in my left hand. I am not ambidextrous. I have never written with my left hand in my life, not once. The grip was awkward, foreign, utterly unnatural. I lowered the nib to the paper. I wrote A. Sterling. It was shaky. It was slanted the wrong way. The pressure points were all wrong, the loops jagged and uneven. It looked like the writing of a child, or a very sick, confused man. But more importantly, to the discerning eyes of the law and forensic science, it was a signature made under extreme duress with a non-dominant hand, which fundamentally alters the biometric rhythm of the writing. I knew this because I had presided over a probate case in 1998 where a will was invalidated for this exact reason. A signature that deviates more than 40% from the baseline motor control of the subject is immediately flagged as suspicious, a red flag for fraud. By signing with my left hand, I was practically stamping the document with the word fraud in invisible ink. "There," I whispered, dropping the pen, letting it clatter. "Done." Abigail snatched the paper up before the ink was even dry. She scrutinized it, her eyes narrow, suspicious. It was ugly, barely legible, but it was legible enough for a busy bank teller who didn't care to look too closely. A clerk focused on throughput, not forensic detail. "Finally," she muttered, a huff of relief escaping her lips. She didn't say thank you. She didn't apologize for the screaming or the shaking. She stuffed the signed papers into her manila envelope with a triumphant flourish. "Get him cleaned up," she said to Brandon, gesturing vaguely at me with a wave of her hand. "He looks pathetic." She marched out of the room, the heels of her shoes striking the floor with the rhythmic cadence of a victory march. She thought she had just won the keys to the kingdom. She thought she now owned me, my house, and my entire fortune. Brandon looked at me with a mixture of disgust and pity, shaking his head. "You really made that harder than it needed to be, Harry. We're just trying to help you." He didn't help me up. He didn't check my bleeding hand. He turned and followed his wife, closing the door behind him. I sat alone in the wheelchair, listening to their footsteps fade down the hallway. I heard them high-five. I heard the pop of a champagne cork again. They were celebrating my erasure, my death. I looked down at my right hand. The blood from where Abigail's nails had broken the skin was smearing onto my trousers, a deep crimson against the light fabric. I didn't wipe it off. I needed that. I needed the wound to scab over. I needed the physical proof of the coercion, the tangible evidence of their abuse. I stood up from the wheelchair. My legs were stronger today. The detox was working, my body slowly reclaiming itself. I walked to the bathroom and looked at myself in the mirror. They had the paper, yes, but that paper was a meticulously crafted trap. When I stood in court and showed Judge Vance that signature, when I showed her the undeniable difference between my precise, right-handed script and that crude, left-handed scrawl, and when I combined that with the testimony of my bloody hand and the audio recording of Abigail screaming at me to die already, that document wouldn't just be void. It would be the primary exhibit in a felony extortion trial. I washed the blood off my hand, carefully patting it dry, preserving the evidence in my mind. I walked back to the window and looked out at the old oak tree, my silent confidant. The evidence was safe. Sarah knew the plan. The trap was sprung. Now all I had to do was wait for them to make their next move. They would try to move me soon. They wouldn't want me in the house when they started liquidating the assets, bringing in buyers. They would try to dump me, and that, precisely, would be the moment I disappeared, only to reappear as their worst nightmare. I climbed back into bed, pulling the sheets up to my chin. I closed my eyes, but I didn't sleep. I replayed the entire scene in my mind, memorizing every word, every gesture, every second of their cruelty, their greed. I was building the file in my head, page by page, a meticulous, damning dossier, and it was going to be a masterpiece of justice. They came for me at dawn, just as the sky over Lake Michigan was turning a bruised purple and gray. I was awake, of course. I hadn't slept since I signed those papers with my left hand. I was waiting for the final betrayal, and it arrived in the form of two men who looked less like medical professionals and more like bouncers at a dive bar. They didn't knock. They didn't introduce themselves. They simply barged into my room, filling the space with the smell of stale coffee and aggressive impatience. One of them, a hulking man with a neck as thick as a tree trunk, grabbed my arm. "Mr. Sterling, time to go," he grunted, pulling at me. I didn't resist. I let my body go limp, playing the part of the confused geriatric to the bitter end, mumbling, looking around wildly. "Where is Eleanor? Is it time for bingo at the community center?" Abigail appeared in the doorway, wearing oversized sunglasses even though the sun hadn't fully risen. She couldn't look me in the eye. She looked at her expensive shoes, at the wall, at the heavy grip the orderly had on my bicep. "It's for the best, Dad," she said, her voice tight and brittle, devoid of conviction. "We found a place that can give you the care we can't. Professionals. It's beautiful. You'll love it." Liar. Every word was a calculated fabrication. They marched me out of the house I had built, past the garden where I had buried the evidence, and shoved me into the back of an unmarked white van. There were no windows in the back, just a cold metal cage separating me from the driver. It wasn't a medical transport, it was a prisoner transfer. We drove for an hour. I felt the smooth pavement of the highway give way to the potholed, neglected roads of the industrial outskirts, the forgotten corners of the city. We weren't going to the Golden Horizon facility she had shown me brochures for, the one with the lake views and the organic chef. We were heading to the places people go when they have been erased, when society has deemed them disposable. When the doors opened, the smell hit me first. It was a physical blow, a noxious assault on my senses. Urine, boiled cabbage, and cheap bleach, trying desperately to cover up the pervasive scent of decay and despair. I looked up at the sign above the peeling paint of the entrance. Sunny Meadows. The name was a cruel, sardonic joke. The building itself was a brutal concrete block with barred windows, surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with razor wire. It looked precisely like a minimum security prison for the forgotten. The orderlies dragged me inside. The lobby was dim, lit by flickering fluorescent tubes that buzzed like trapped insects. The floor was sticky beneath my slippers. In the corner, an old woman in a wheelchair was staring vacantly at a blank television screen, rocking back and forth, muttering to herself. utterly ignored. No one was attending to her. They brought me to the intake desk. A woman behind the thick plexiglass, looking bored and tired, barely glanced up from her magazine. "Name?" she asked, popping a bubble of gum with an irritating snap. "Arthur Sterling," the orderly said, tossing a crumpled manila envelope onto the counter. "Standard admit. Payment secured for the first month. Cash." I listened closely. Cash. That meant no paper trail, no bank transfer linking this hellhole to my accounts, no evidence for an auditor to find. "Room 304, the woman said, handing him a key. "It's a double. He's bunking with Mr. Henderson. Tell him not to mind the screaming at night. Henderson has night terrors." They dragged me down a hallway that seemed to stretch into infinity, a corridor of lost souls. The rooms were cells, 2 beds, a small sink, a toilet with no seat. They shoved me into room 304. My roommate was a skeletal figure curled into a fetal position on a mattress that was thinner than a yoga mat. The big orderly pushed me onto the empty bed, a crude gesture. "You stay here, Pops. Lunch is at noon. Don't cause trouble, or we sedate you." They left, locking the door from the outside with a heavy, final clang. I sat on the mattress. It crunched with plastic. They had put plastic covers on the mattresses, making them easier to hose down, like animal cages. I looked around the room. There was mold growing in the corner of the ceiling. The window was caked with grime so thick I couldn't even see outside. This was it. This was their plan, their ultimate discard. They had stolen my car, my money, my home, and now my freedom. And the cost? I saw a faded flyer taped to the back of the door. Monthly rates starting at $800. $800. I did the math in my head, a cold fury rising in my chest. They had just cleared nearly $500,000 from my trust. They were about to sell my house for almost $4 million, pocketing a substantial, ill-gotten sum. And they had dumped me in a place that cost less than their monthly car lease payment. They weren't just greedy. They were cheap, utterly contemptible. They didn't just want me gone. They wanted to maximize the profit margin on my disposal. They valued my life, my comfort, my dignity at $800 a month. I sat there for 2 hours. I listened to Mr. Henderson moan in his sleep, a heartbreaking sound. I watched a cockroach scuttle boldly across the floor, a symbol of the decay. I felt the full weight of the injustice pressing down on me, turning the carbon of my anger into a diamond of unshakable resolve. Then I checked my watch. A quiet, familiar action. It was 10 a.m. If my calculations were correct, Abigail and Brandon were currently at brunch in Willow Creek, toasting to their new freedom, their ill-gotten gains. They thought I was processed, locked away, and silenced. They had likely thrown away my burner phone, assuming I was too senile to know how to use it anyway. But they forgot one crucial thing. I was the gavel, and I never, ever went into a high-stakes situation without backup. At precisely 10:15 a.m., the front doors of Sunny Meadows burst open. I heard it from my room, far down the hall, a sudden commotion, voices raised. Not the usual shouts of the residents, but a sharp, authoritative voice that cut through the stagnant, foul-smelling air like a knife. "I demand to see the director immediately." It was Sarah. I stood up, my legs surprisingly steady. I walked to the door and pressed my ear against it. "You cannot just barge in here," the receptionist squeaked, clearly intimidated. "I am a partner at Jenkins and Associates." Sarah's voice boomed, echoing off the linoleum floors, a force of legal nature. "I have a writ of habeas corpus issued by the Federal Court of the Northern District of Illinois, signed by Judge Vance herself not 20 minutes ago. You are holding a United States citizen against his will, without valid medical cause, and based on fraudulent power of attorney documents. If you do not open door 304 inches the next 30 seconds, I will have this entire facility shut down for health code violations, elder abuse, and kidnapping before you can finish popping that gum. Do you understand me?" There was a stunned silence. Then the frantic jingle of keys, a hurried, panicked sound. Footsteps hurried down the hall. Not the heavy, plodding gait of the orderlies, but the sharp, rapid click of expensive heels. The lock turned. The door swung open. Sarah stood there. She was a vision of legal vengeance, of righteous fury. She wore a tailored black suit that cost more than this entire decaying building. She held a leather briefcase in one hand and a court order in the other. Behind her, the facility director, a sweating man in a cheap, ill-fitting tie, looked like he was about to vomit. "Mr. Sterling," Sarah said, her voice softening just a fraction as she looked at me, a flicker of genuine relief in her eyes. "Are you ready to check out?" I straightened my spine, a small, defiant act. I brushed a speck of dust from my pajama sleeve. I looked at the director, whose eyes were wide with terror. "I will be expecting a full refund of the $800, I said calmly, my voice regaining its old timbre. "And I suggest you get a lawyer. A good one." We walked out of Sunny Meadows without looking back, leaving the stench and despair behind. Sarah's car, a black S-Class Mercedes, was idling at the curb. The driver, a discreet man, opened the door for me. The leather seats were soft, smelling of new car and blessed safety. As soon as the door closed, shielding us from the foul stench of the facility, Sarah handed me a bag. "I took the liberty of stopping at your tailor," she said, a small, knowing smile on her lips, "and I brought your shaving kit." I didn't waste time. While we drove back toward the city, toward the courthouse, toward justice, I transformed. I used the vanity mirror and the electric razor to shave off the gray stubble of the senile old man. I wiped the grime from my face with a hot towel from the car's cooler. I stripped off the humiliating pajamas Abigail had dressed me in and put on the charcoal three-piece suit Sarah had brought. It was my armor. The fabric was familiar, empowering, a tangible connection to my former self. I tied my tie, a Windsor knot, perfect and tight. I put on my gold cufflinks. I slid my watch onto my wrist. I looked at my reflection in the glass. The old man who shuffled and mumbled, "The lost puppy," was gone. In his place sat Arthur Sterling. The gavel. Sarah watched me, a small, fierce smile playing on her lips. "We have the toxicology report from the FBI lab," she said, her voice filled with grim satisfaction. "Arsenic, low dose, mixed with benzodiazepines, enough to mimic dementia. Enough to kill you in a month." "And the bank records?" I asked, adjusting my cuffs, feeling the surge of my old strength returning. "Secured," she confirmed. "The transfers to the shell company are traced. The sale listing for the house is preserved. We have them, Harry, dead to rights." I looked out the window. The skyline of Chicago was rising before us, gleaming in the morning sun, a symbol of power and progress. Somewhere in that vast city, my daughter and her husband were laughing, spending money that wasn't theirs, thinking they had won. They had no idea that the storm was coming, that judgment was at hand. I turned to Sarah. The time for gathering evidence is over. The time for mercy passed 3 months ago when they sold my car, when they desecrated Eleanor's memory. I checked my watch. "We have a hearing in 1 hour. Step on it," I said to the driver, my voice resonating with authority. Then I looked at Sarah, and for the first time in months, I smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. It was the smile of a predator who has just spotted its unsuspecting prey in the open. "It's time to hunt, Sarah. Let's go to court." The oak doors of Courtroom 3B were heavy, solid wood, burnished with time, having absorbed the echoes of 1,000 lies and 1,000 verdicts. I stood outside them for a moment, adjusting my cufflinks, feeling the cool, familiar weight of the courthouse air. It smelled of floor wax, old paper, and the distinct metallic tang of anxiety, a scent I knew intimately. To most people, this smell induced fear, dread. To me, it smelled like home. Sarah stood beside me, her hand resting lightly on the brass handle. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. She knew the play. She pushed the doors open, and we stepped into the arena. The scene inside was a masterpiece of staged grief, a carefully orchestrated tableau. Abigail and Brandon were sitting at the plaintiff's table, dressed in somber, expensive black. Abigail was dabbing at her dry eyes with a lace handkerchief, her shoulders shaking with a performance of sorrow that would have been moving, genuinely convincing, if I hadn't known she was checking her stock portfolio on her smartwatch 5 minutes ago. Brandon sat beside her, his head bowed, playing the part of the stoic, burdened son-in-law, the noble man forced to make the hard choice for the family's own good. Their lawyer, a slick, self-assured man named Mr. Sterling, no relation to me, thankfully, with a suit that cost more than my first house, was standing before the bench, his voice dropping to a theatrical hush. "Your Honor," he intoned, gesturing vaguely to the empty seat where I was supposed to be, the chair reserved for the senile. "This is not a petition we bring lightly. Mr. Sterling was a titan of the community, a man of immense respect. To see him reduced to this state, to a man who attacks his own caregivers, who wanders the streets confused, who cannot even feed himself, it is a tragedy." He shook his head mournfully. "But for his own safety, and to preserve the remains of his estate from his own chaotic impulses, we must ask for immediate and total emergency guardianship. We have the medical reports from Dr. Corbin citing rapid cognitive collapse. We have the incident reports. We have no choice." Judge Eleanor Vance sat behind the high bench, looking over her spectacles, her gaze weary. I knew Judge Vance. 20 years ago, she was a promising young prosecutor who had been framed for evidence tampering by a corrupt police chief. I was the federal judge who saw the inconsistencies, who subpoenaed the hidden tapes that ultimately cleared her name and saved her career. She was a good woman, a fair woman, but she looked tired, burdened by the weight of her responsibilities. She was nodding slowly, buying the narrative Mr. Sterling was selling because she had no reason not to. She hadn't seen Arthur Sterling, the gavel, in over 10 years. She expected to see a ghost of the man she once knew. And then I stepped into the aisle. The sound of my highly polished leather shoes on the marble floor was sharp and rhythmic. Click, click, click. It wasn't the shuffle of a slippered invalid. It was the purposeful march of a soldier returning to the front lines, the steady cadence of a man on a mission. The sound cut through Sterling's mournful monologue. A sudden, jarring interruption. Heads turned. The court reporter stopped typing mid-sentence. Officer Miller, the bailiff, who had been leaning against the wall, looking bored, straightened up with a snap, his eyes widening in recognition. I walked down the center aisle, my back straight, my chin held high. I wasn't using a cane. I wasn't wearing the stained, humiliating pajamas they had sent me away in. I was wearing my charcoal three-piece suit, the one I had worn to my own retirement ceremony, the one that perfectly fit my revitalized frame. I looked impeccable. I looked dangerous. Abigail turned in her seat. When she saw me, her initial reaction wasn't fear. It was amusement. She was so deep in her delusion, so utterly convinced of her own victory, that she couldn't process the reality in front of her. She giggled, that same cruel, dismissive sound that had haunted me for months. She leaned over to Brandon, whispering loud enough to carry in the sudden, shocked silence. "Look at him! He looks like a lost child playing dress-up. I bet he thinks we're taking him to a buffet. He probably doesn't even know where he is." Brandon didn't look at me directly. He shook his head, a smirk playing on his lips, turning his gaze away as if looking at me was beneath him, an act of condescension. He was already spending the money in his head. He was already redesigning the kitchen, perhaps picking out the new sports car he'd buy with my inheritance. But Judge Vance wasn't looking at them. She was looking at me. As I passed the bar and stepped into the well of the court, the sacred space before the bench, Judge Vance's face went pale. The blood drained from her cheeks so fast I thought she might faint. Her hand, reaching for her water glass, began to tremble. She took off her glasses, rubbed her eyes, and looked again, her gaze fixed on me. She knew that walk. She knew that suit. She knew the man who had taught her that the law is a shield for the innocent, not a sword for the powerful. The silence in the room became heavy, suffocating. It pressed against the eardrums, a palpable weight. Judge Vance leaned into her microphone, her voice barely a whisper, yet it boomed through the speakers like a thunderclap, filled with an ancient awe. "My God," she murmured again, "is that really him?" Abigail stopped smiling. She looked at the judge, confused by her reaction. She didn't understand. She thought I was just her senile father. She didn't know I was a legend in this building, a pillar of federal jurisprudence. She didn't know that the woman sitting on the bench considered me her mentor, her savior, the man who had given her a second chance. I didn't stop at the defendant's table. I walked right past Mr. Sterling, who stumbled back, as if he had been physically pushed by the sheer force of my presence. I walked until I was standing directly in front of the bench, eye to eye with the woman who held the power to destroy me or save me, the woman who would now enact justice. I looked at Judge Vance. I gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod, a silent signal, a coded message. Asterisk, I am here. I am awake, and I am profoundly angry. Asterisk. Then I turned slowly to face the courtroom. I looked at Abigail. Her smile was gone now, replaced by a flicker of unease, a dawning horror. She was starting to realize that the script had irrevocably changed. I looked at Brandon, who was finally looking up from his phone, his mouth slightly open, a line of cold sweat appearing on his forehead. I didn't sit down. I didn't wait for a lawyer to speak for me. Sarah sat quietly at the counsel table, opening her briefcase, ready to hand me the ammunition. But this was my fight. I was the one pulling the trigger. I turned back to the judge. I placed my hands on the podium. They were steady. Rock steady. Your Honor, I said, my voice deep and resonant, the voice that had sentenced hardened men to life without parole, the voice that had been silenced for 3 months of hell, now clear and powerful. I apologize for the interruption. My daughter and her husband seem to be laboring under a significant misapprehension regarding my mental faculties. They believe they are here to collect a guardianship over a helpless old man. I paused, letting the words hang in the air, allowing their weight to settle. I turned my head slightly, catching Abigail's eye. She looked terrified, a deer caught in headlights. But I am not here to defend my competency, Judge Vance. I am here to act as a prosecutor. I am appearing pro se, and I am not asking for a dismissal of this ludicrous petition. I took a breath, filling my lungs with the clean, resonant air of the courtroom, the air of justice. Your Honor, I demand that the docket be amended immediately. I am filing a cross-petition. I request that this court try the petitioners, Abigail Sterling and Brandon Miller, on charges of grand larceny, elder abuse, fraud, and attempted murder. And I have the evidence to prove it, right here, right now. The courtroom erupted. Mr. Sterling, their lawyer, dropped his papers, scattering them across the floor. Brandon stood up abruptly, knocking his chair over with a loud crash. Abigail let out a strangled gasp, a sound of pure terror. Judge Vance banged her gavel, not to silence me, but to silence them. Order! Judge Vance roared, her eyes blazing with a fury I hadn't seen in 20 years, a righteous indignation. Order in this court. Mr. Sterling, you may proceed. I smiled. It was a cold, terrible smile. The trap was sprung, the lion was out of the cage, and it was feeding time. The gavel's final bang was still echoing in the high ceiling of the courtroom as I turned my gaze slowly to the gallery. The silence was absolute, a vacuum created by the sudden, seismic shift in power. Abigail was gripping the edge of the table so hard her knuckles were white, her carefully constructed facade crumbling. Brandon was staring intently at his expensive shoes, perhaps realizing for the first time that his internet schemes and street smarts were utterly useless in a federal court setting. I didn't look at them directly, not yet. I looked past them to the third row where a sweating man in an ill-fitting suit was trying desperately to make himself invisible. I call Dr. Miles Corbin to the stand, I announced, my voice filling the room without the need for a microphone, cutting through the lingering tension. Corbin froze. He looked to Brandon for help, his eyes pleading, but Brandon was busy pretending he didn't exist, shrinking in his seat. Officer Miller, the bailiff, a burly man who had worked my courtroom for years, moved toward the aisle with a grim expression. Corbin stood up shakily, his knees audibly knocking together. He walked to the witness stand like a man walking to the gallows, his movements heavy and reluctant. He was sworn in, his hand trembling as he placed it on the Bible. He sat down, wiping his forehead with a handkerchief that was already damp with nervous sweat. Mr. Sterling, Judge Vance said, nodding to me, her eyes firm and resolute. Your witness. I didn't go to the podium. I walked directly up to the witness box, encroaching on his personal space, looming over him with the full weight of my presence. I let the silence stretch, letting him stew in his own profound anxiety. State your name and occupation for the record, I said, my voice low, controlled, but carrying immense power. Reginald Evans, he squeaked, correcting himself. I am a geriatric specialist. A neurologist? A neurologist, I repeated, savoring the word, letting its weight settle in the room. Impressive. Tell me, Doctor. Corbin, in your expert opinion, what was the primary indicator of my rapid cognitive decline? Corbin licked his lips, his eyes darting frantically around the room, avoiding my unwavering gaze. Well, Mr. Sterling, it was the confusion, the disorientation, the tremors, classic signs of advanced degeneration. I see. And scientifically speaking, which specific part of the brain was affected? Was it the frontal lobe, the hippocampus, the cerebellum? I pressed, my questions precise, calculated. It was, yes, both. Generalized atrophy. Very sad. He mumbled, clearly unprepared for a real neurological cross-examination. I leaned in closer, my voice dropping to a near whisper, yet it felt like a shout. And did you observe any issues with my Wernicke's area, Doctor? Corbin blinked, momentarily stunned. Excuse me? My Wernicke's area, Doctor, I repeated, enunciating clearly. Surely a neurologist knows what that is. Did you observe aphasia? Did you check for the Babinski sign? Corbin was sweating profusely now. Sweat was dripping down his nose, making his skin glisten. Well, of course. The Babinski was very positive. Very bad. I smiled. It was a wolf's smile, a predator's grin. That is fascinating, Doctor, because the Babinski sign is a reflex in the foot, indicative of upper motor neuron damage. You never asked me to take off my shoes during your so-called examination, and Wernicke's area controls language comprehension. If mine was damaged, I wouldn't be able to understand your lies right now, let alone construct this cross-examination. A ripple of murmurs went through the courtroom, hushed whispers of shock and revelation. Corbin turned an ashen pale. I meant it was a preliminary diagnosis, he stammered, scrambling for an excuse. Preliminary? I scoffed, my voice rising. You prescribed medication, potent medication, based on a glance at my shoes and a check of my pulse through a thick wool sweater? I walked back to the counsel table where Sarah was waiting. She handed me a plastic evidence bag. Inside was the orange bottle Dr. Corbin had given me, its bright blue pills a stark contrast to the sterile plastic. Do you recognize this, Doctor? I asked, holding up the bag. Corbin stared at the bottle as if it were a live cobra, his eyes wide with fear. Yes, that is the medication I prescribed. A sedative to help you sleep, to calm the agitation. A custom compound, you called it, I said, holding the bottle up for Judge Vance to see. For the jury of public opinion to witness. Concierge medicine. Yes. Just a mild relaxant. Standard for your condition, you claimed. I turned to Sarah again. She handed me a thick document with the seal of the Federal Bureau of Investigation stamped on the cover. I felt a surge of gratitude for my old friends at the Bureau, who hadn't forgotten the favors I did them in the 90 seconds, the battles we fought together against the darkness. I have here a toxicology report from the FBI Forensic Laboratory in Quantico, I said, my voice rising, filling the room with its gravitas. I sent them a sample of these pills 3 weeks ago, along with a sample of the soil from a snake plant that died 3 days after I watered it with this solution. Abigail let out a small, strangled gasp, her hand flying to her mouth. I ignored her, my focus entirely on the quaking figure in the witness box. Would you like to know what is in your mild relaxant, Dr. Corbin? Corbin didn't answer. He was shaking his head, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, desperately gasping for air. It contains ketamine, I read calmly from the report, allowing the damning words to sink in. A horse tranquilizer, in doses high enough to knock out a thoroughbred. But that is not the worst part. I slammed the report down on the railing of the witness box, the sound like a gunshot in the silent room. It also contains arsenic. The word hung in the air, a chilling pronouncement of death. The courtroom erupted. People gasped. A woman in the back row screamed. Judge Vance slammed her gavel, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. Order! Order! I leaned into Corbin's face, my voice a dangerous whisper. Arsenic, Doctor. A heavy metal poison. Low dose. Just enough to cause tremors, confusion, organ failure. Just enough to mimic the symptoms of the dementia you diagnosed. You weren't treating me. You were murdering me. No! Corbin shrieked, standing up abruptly, his composure completely shattered. No! It wasn't supposed to kill you. Just make you sick. Just make you pliable so you'd sign. You admit it, I roared, my voice now truly the gavel's, thundering through the room. You admit you poisoned me. They told me to. Corbin pointed a shaking, accusing finger at Brandon and Abigail, now cowering at the plaintiff's table. He was hysterical, tears streaming down his face. They said he was difficult. They said he needed to be managed until the papers were signed. I didn't know about the arsenic. I just mixed what Brandon gave me. Brandon jumped up, his face a mask of outrage. He's lying. He's a crazy old quack. Sit down, Judge Vance bellowed, her voice shaking the very foundations of the courtroom. Bailiff, secure the defendant. I wasn't done with Corbin. I had one more nail for his coffin. You aren't a doctor, are you, Corbin? I asked, my voice deadly calm amidst the escalating chaos. Corbin collapsed back into the chair, sobbing into his hands. No, I was a pharmacist. They took my license. I had gambling debts. Brandon said he would pay them off. He said it was just sleeping pills. Please, I didn't want to kill anyone. You are a disgraced pharmacist, practicing medicine without a license, and conspiring to commit murder, I said, turning my back on him, dismissing him. I have nothing further for this witness, Your Honor, but I believe the state police might. Judge Vance looked at Corbin with pure disgust, a profound sense of betrayal. Bailiff, Judge Vance said, her voice ice cold, take Mr. Evans into custody, charge him with practicing without a license, fraud, and attempted murder, and read him his rights. He is going to need them. 2 bailiffs moved in. They hauled Corbin out of the witness box. He was weeping, begging, his legs dragging on the floor as they pulled him toward the side door. The sharp click of the handcuffs echoed through the silent room, a sound of absolute finality. I stood in the center of the well, adjusting my cufflinks. I looked at Abigail. Her face was gray, devoid of color. She looked like a statue of terror, utterly frozen. She knew that Corbin had just handed me the very weapon I needed to destroy them both. Brandon was staring at the empty witness chair, his mouth agape. The arrogance was gone. The smugness had evaporated. He looked like a man who had just realized he was standing on a trap door, and it was about to give way. I turned to the judge. Your Honor, I said, my voice steady, confident. That was the appetizer. Now, if the court pleases, I would like to move on to the main course, the money. Judge Vance nodded slowly, a grim satisfaction in her eyes. Proceed, Mr. Sterling. I walked back to the counsel table. Sarah handed me the next file. The financial records, the irrefutable bank transfers, the smoking gun that would prove my daughter and her husband hadn't just tried to kill me. They had tried to rob my corpse before I was even dead. I looked at the USB drive in my hand. It felt heavy, burdened with their crimes. I called Brandon Miller to the stand, I said. The hunt continued, and I wasn't leaving until the cage was full. The bailiffs were still dragging the sobbing Dr. Miles Corbin out of the courtroom when I turned my attention back to the defense table. The air in the room was electric, charged with the ozone smell of a storm that had finally broken. Abigail was no longer looking at me with disdain or amusement. She was looking at me with the wide, terrified eyes of a deer, realizing the headlights are attached to a semi-truck bearing down on it. Brandon, however, was trying to rally. He straightened his tie, puffed out his chest, and attempted to put on a mask of righteous indignation. It was a flimsy mask, cracking at the edges, but it was all he had left. I call Brandon Miller to the stand, I said again, my voice cutting through the murmurs of the gallery, demanding attention. Brandon stood up. He buttoned his jacket, a nervous tic I had noticed years ago, a tell that always preceded his lies. He walked to the witness stand with a swagger that was entirely unearned, trying to project the image of a successful businessman who was simply misunderstood, caught in a family spat. He took the oath, his hand resting on the Bible, swearing to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. The irony was thick enough to choke on. He sat down, adjusting the microphone. He looked at the jury box, flashing a charming, boyish smile that had probably worked on his unsuspecting mother, but was utterly useless here, in this room, before this judge. Mr. Miller, I began, standing behind the podium, resting my hands on the polished wood, adopting the measured tone of an experienced prosecutor. Let us clarify your role in my life over the past 3 months. You moved into my home. You took control of my schedule. You managed my affairs. Is that correct? Brandon nodded solemnly, maintaining his facade. Yes, Harry. I mean, Mr. Sterling. Abigail and I, we just wanted to help. You were grieving. You were confused. We stepped in to shoulder the burden. We only wanted what was best for you. What was best for me, I repeated, letting the phrase hang in the air, allowing its bitter taste to sink in. You are a devoted son-in-law, then. Selfless. I try to be, Brandon said, lowering his head modestly, still clinging to the performance. Family comes first. I walked over to the counsel table. Sarah handed me a remote control. I pointed it at the large projection screen mounted on the wall to the left of Judge Vance's bench. Let us talk about my car, Brandon. My 1967 Shelby Mustang. You told me you took it for service. You told me it was unsafe for me to drive. Brandon shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes darting. Yes, that's right. The brakes were shot. The steering was loose. I was protecting you, Harry. I clicked the remote. A document appeared on the screen. It was a bill of sale, dated the morning after my car had mysteriously disappeared. It was signed, unequivocally, by Brandon Miller. The buyer was listed as Exotic Auto Salvage, a known chop shop. The sale price was $80,000. Cash. This is a bill of sale, Brandon, I said, my voice hard, uncompromising. You didn't take it to a mechanic. You sold a $220,000 classic car to a chop shop for $80,000 in cash. Is that how you protect me? By liquidating my assets for pennies on the dollar under false pretenses? Brandon's face flushed a deep, ugly red. I had to. The repairs were too expensive. I was going to put the money back into the house upkeep. It was a financial decision. A financial decision, I echoed, my tone dripping with skepticism. I see. I clicked the remote again. A new document appeared on the screen. It was a digital bank statement from an offshore gambling website called BetKing. The account was registered to Brandon Miller. The date was the exact same day as the car sale. The deposit amount was exactly $80,000. Can you explain to the court, Mr. Miller, how depositing the proceeds of my stolen car into an online poker account constitutes house upkeep? The courtroom gasped. It was a collective intake of breath, a wave of shock washing over the gallery. Brandon opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked at his lawyer, Mr. Sterling. But Sterling was busy studying his manicured fingernails, clearly realizing he wasn't getting paid enough for this unfolding disaster. I have a system, Brandon stammered, sweat beading on his upper lip, his composure cracking. I was trying to grow the money for you, to help with your medical bills. You were gambling with my property, I said, cutting him off, my voice sharp. You stole my car. You sold it. You gambled the money. That is grand larceny, a felony under federal law. But that is just the tip of the iceberg, isn't it, Brandon? I didn't wait for an answer. I clicked the remote again. The screen filled with a dense spreadsheet. It was the transaction history of the Sterling Family Trust. Rows and rows of numbers. But I had highlighted a specific set of transfers in bright yellow. $450,000, I said, reading the total at the bottom. Over the course of 12 weeks, you transferred nearly $500,000 from my retirement trust to an entity called J&V Consulting LLC. I turned to look at him, my gaze piercing. Tell us, Brandon, what is J&V Consulting? Is it a medical firm? A law firm? Brandon was gripping the arms of the witness chair so hard his knuckles were white, his posture rigid. It's a management company. We handle logistics, lifestyle curation. It's legitimate. We bill for our time, for the stress. Taking care of you is a full-time job. Lifestyle curation, I scoffed, a sneer twisting my lips. I clicked the remote one more time. The screen changed to show the corporate registration for J&V Consulting. The registered address was my own house in Willow Creek. The officers were Brandon Miller and Abigail Sterling. You incorporated a shell company using my address, I said, my voice rising, thundering through the room, filling every corner with righteous indignation. You paid yourselves $500,000 to feed me oatmeal and cut my phone lines. You charged me $450,000 to hold me prisoner in my own home. That is not management, Brandon. That is embezzlement. That is wire fraud. Brandon was shaking now, visibly trembling. He looked small. He looked pathetic. But he wasn't done. He had one last desperate lie, one last attempt to save himself. "You don't understand!" he cried out, his voice cracking, desperate. "We earned that money. You were difficult. You were violent. You don't remember because you were sick. But we did everything for you. We loved you. We were only trying to make you comfortable." "Before the end," I repeated softly, finishing his sentence for him, my voice chillingly calm. I walked back to the council table. I picked up the small USB drive I had hidden under the toilet tank lid. I held it up. It glinted under the harsh courtroom lights. "You claimed you wanted me comfortable. You claimed you loved me. You claimed I was sick." I turned to Judge Vance. "Your Honor, I have one final piece of evidence to present. This is an audio recording. It was captured by a voice-activated recorder I planted in the dining room of my home 3 weeks ago, on the night my daughter and son-in-law threw a party to celebrate my imminent demise." I handed the drive to the court clerk. She plugged it into the courtroom sound system. Brandon's eyes went wide with dawning horror. He started to stand up. "No, you can't. That is illegal." "Sit down!" Judge Vance barked, her voice like a whip crack. "Play the recording." The clerk pressed play. For a moment there was only the faint sound of static and the clinking of glasses. Then Brandon's voice filled the courtroom. It was loud, slurred with alcohol, booming from the speakers with crystal clarity. "To the new owners," Brandon's recorded voice shouted. "Cheers," a chorus of voices replied, drunken and celebratory. Then Abigail's voice, sharp and eager. "God, I thought he would never go to sleep." "Did you give him the double dose?" "Yeah," Brandon's voice replied, followed by a cruel, wet laugh. "He's out cold, drooling on the pillow. Look, babe, don't worry. Slick Sam said we can list it next week. Once we dump him at Sunny Meadows, the place is ours." Then came the line, the sentence that sucked all the air out of the room, that stripped away any pretense of care or love. "Honestly," Brandon's voice said, dropping lower, darker, "the old man is just taking up space. The sooner he kicks the bucket, the better. He's worth more dead than he is alive anyway. Why wait for nature? Dr. Corbin said the liver failure will look natural. Just another week, babe. Just another week, and we're free." The recording ended. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. It was the silence of a tomb. Brandon was frozen in the witness chair, his face gray, devoid of all life. He looked like a man who had just watched his own execution. I looked at him. I didn't feel triumph. I felt a deep, cold sorrow, a profound regret for the waste of a human life. This was the man my daughter had chosen. This was the man I had welcomed into my family, into my home. "You didn't just want my money, Brandon," I said, my voice quiet, but carrying to every corner of the room, piercing the silence. "You wanted my life. You joked about my murder while drinking my wine, in my house." Brandon slumped. He collapsed in on himself, sliding down in the chair until his chin hit his chest. He began to weep, ugly, gasping sobs. "It wasn't my idea," he blubbered, pointing a shaking, accusing finger at the plaintiff's table, at Abigail. "It was her. It was Abigail. She said she hated you. She said she wanted the money. She made me get the pills." Abigail screamed. It was a feral, animalistic sound, stripped of all pretense. "You coward! You liar! It was you! You sold the car! You found the doctor! Don't you dare put this on me!" She lunged at him, actually trying to climb over the table to get to him, a wild fury in her eyes. Her lawyer, Mr. Sterling, had to grab her by the waist to hold her back, his face a mixture of horror and professional embarrassment. "Order!" Judge Vance was standing now, banging her gavel so hard I thought the handle would snap. "Bailiffs, restrain them!" 2 bailiffs grabbed Abigail, expertly pulling her back. 2 more moved toward Brandon in the witness box. I stood in the center of the storm, untouched, observing. I watched them turn on each other. The love they claimed to have, the partnership, the united front. It all disintegrated the moment the harsh light of truth hit it. They were rats in a bucket, clawing over each other to escape the rising water.